My name is Warren Hayes. I am 54 years old, and I've worked as a backcountry bush pilot in Idaho for 27 years, specializing in flying supplies and people into remote wilderness airstrips in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, the largest contiguous wilderness area in the lower 48 states. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, please. I fly a Super Cub on oversized tundra tires, perfect for the short, rough dirt strips that serve as the only access points to huge sections of Idaho wilderness. The Frank Church Wilderness contains 2.3 million acres of roadless country, with mountain ranges, river canyons, and forests, so remote that the only way in or out from most locations is by foot, horseback, or small aircraft, like mine. I've made thousands of flights into dozens of remote strips, carrying hunters, fishermen, supplies for Forest Service cabins, and emergency evacuations when needed. This happened last August during what should have been a routine supply flight to a Forest Service backcountry airstrip called Indian Creek, located about 70 miles from the nearest road deep in the central wilderness. I'd flown into Indian Creek maybe 50 times over my 27-year career, knew the approach intimately, knew the strip's quirks and challenges. I took off from my base in Salmon, Idaho around 7 a.m. with a load of supplies for a Forest Service trail crew working in that area. The flight out was perfect. Clear weather, smooth air, beautiful morning light, illuminating the endless mountains and forests below. I reached Indian Creek around 8:15 a.m. and set up for landing on the 1,200-foot dirt strip, carved into a narrow meadow surrounded by forest. I landed smoothly, taxied to the end of the strip, and shut down the engine. The trail crew was supposed to meet me at the airstrip, but nobody was there. This wasn't too unusual. Sometimes crews get delayed on the trail. I decided to wait, unloaded the supplies from the plane, and sat down to have coffee from my thermos. After about 30 minutes with no sign of the crew, I started to feel uneasy. Something about the silence felt wrong. The Frank Church Wilderness is full of sound during summer. Birds calling, insects buzzing, wind in the trees, the distant rush of the Salmon River. But sitting there on that airstrip, I heard nothing. Complete silence that felt unnatural and oppressive. I walked to the edge of the strip where the forest began, maybe 50 yards from my plane. I called out loudly, trying to get the attention of the trail crew if they were nearby. No response. I walked a bit further, following a trail that led from the airstrip toward where I knew the crew's camp was supposed to be located, maybe a quarter mile into the forest. I found their camp, 4 tents set up in a clearing, camp stove, food storage, all the equipment a trail crew would have, but no people. The camp looked like it had been abandoned recently. Coffee pot still warm on the camp stove, food items out like someone had been preparing breakfast. But the entire crew, all 6 people, were gone. I searched the area around the camp, calling out, looking for any sign of where they'd gone. I found boot prints leading away from camp into the forest, multiple sets suggesting the whole crew had walked off together. But here's what made no sense. The prints led toward rougher terrain, away from the trails they were supposed to be working on, heading up a steep slope into dense forest. I followed the tracks for maybe 200 yards until they led to an area where the forest opened up into a rockslide zone. The tracks stopped at the edge of the rocks. Just stopped, with no continuation visible on the other side of the slide area. 6 people's boot prints, all ending at the same spot. I went back to the camp and used my satellite phone to call the Forest Service district office. I reported finding the camp abandoned with no sign of the crew. They said they'd send a search and rescue team, but it would take at least a day to get people mobilized and flown in. I made a decision. I was leaving. Something about the situation felt very wrong. The silence, the abandoned camp, the tracks that led nowhere. I hiked back to my plane quickly, did my pre-flight check, and prepared to take off. That is when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. On the dirt airstrip, in soft soil near where I'd parked, there were new tracks, large barefoot prints, easily 19 or 20 inches long with clear toe impressions. They led from the forest edge to my plane, circling around it, then back into the forest. These tracks hadn't been there when I'd landed 90 minutes earlier. Something had approached my plane while I was searching the camp. I got in the plane and started the engine immediately. As I was doing my engine run, up before takeoff, I saw movement at the forest edge maybe 100 yards away. Something large and dark, standing upright, partially obscured by trees. I didn't wait to see more. I advanced the throttle and took off, getting airborne in less than 400 feet, despite my training saying to use the full strip. Search and rescue found the trail crew 2 days later, about 8 miles from their camp, in an area of extremely rough terrain. All 6 were alive, but disoriented, unable to explain coherently how they'd gotten there, or why they'd left camp. They talked about being called or drawn away from camp early in the morning, feeling compelled to walk in a specific direction. They had no memory of the previous 2 days. The official explanation was that the crew had experienced some kind of group psychological event, possibly carbon monoxide poisoning from their camp stove, causing disorientation, even though the stove was functioning properly, and there was no enclosed space where could accumulate. But I talked to other backcountry pilots who fly Idaho Wilderness, people I've known for decades in this small community. Several admitted privately they'd had strange experiences at remote airstrips, camps found abandoned with no explanation, large tracks that didn't match any known wildlife, the sense of being watched, that unnatural silence that makes you want to leave immediately. One pilot told me about an experience at Big Creek Airstrip in 2015. He landed to drop supplies and found a hunting camp completely destroyed. Tents shredded, gear scattered. But the horses were untouched and calm. No sign of the hunters. They were found 3 days later, miles from camp, with no memory of what had happened or how they'd gotten there. The Shoshone, Bannock, and Nez Perce peoples, whose ancestral territories include areas now within the Frank Church Wilderness, have traditional knowledge about beings they describe as mountain giants or forest walkers. According to their teachings, these beings inhabit the most remote sections of the wilderness, particularly the central areas far from any roads, and they have the ability to influence human behavior, drawing people away from camps or causing disorientation. I continue flying backcountry in Idaho because it is my profession, and I love this work, but I no longer land at Indian Creek Airstrip, even though it is a convenient access point for that area, and I trust my instincts completely. Now when I land at a remote strip and experience that unnatural silence, when I find camps that feel abandoned wrong, I don't wait around to investigate. I leave immediately, regardless of my schedule or obligations. The Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness contains 2.3 million acres of roadless wilderness, the largest wilderness area in the lower 48 states, with vast sections that see maybe a dozen people per year. Perfect habitat for something that wants to avoid human contact. And based on what I found at that camp and the 20-inch tracks around my plane and conversations with other pilots, something does live in the deepest sections of that wilderness, something powerful enough and intelligent enough to draw an entire trail crew away from their camp and leave them miles away with no memory, making it clear that in the most remote parts of Idaho, humans are visitors in territory that belongs to something else. My name is Luther Blackwood. I am 41 years old, and I've worked as a professional whitewater rafting guide on the Salmon River in Idaho for 19 years, leading multi-day trips through some of the most spectacular and remote river canyons in North America. This happened last June during a 6-day rafting trip through the main Salmon River, a 79-mile section that flows through the Frank Church Wilderness with no road access, no cell phone coverage, and no way out except by continuing downriver or hiking out over mountain passes. I was leading a group of 8 clients, a family reunion trip, using 2 large rafts to carry people and camping gear. The first 4 days of the trip were perfect. Great weather, good water levels. The clients were happy and enjoying the wilderness experience. We were camping at designated sites along the river, cooking meals on the beach, telling stories around campfires. Exactly the kind of trip I'd led hundreds of times over 19 years. On night 4, we were camped at a site called Lance Bar, a beautiful sandy beach on the inside of a river bend, with a large meadow behind it backed by steep forested slopes. We'd had dinner, cleaned up, and were sitting around the campfire around 10 p.m. when we heard something that made everyone go silent. A scream, not human, not any animal I'd heard in 19 years of guiding on this river. It came from the forested slope above camp, maybe 300 yards away, echoing down through the canyon. It was loud, sustained for maybe 8 or 9 seconds, starting low and rising to a high pitch that made the hair on my neck stand up. The clients looked at me for explanation. I told them it was probably an elk or mountain lion, trying to sound casual. But I'd heard both many times, and this was neither. We sat there listening. After maybe 10 minutes, the scream came again, closer this time, maybe 200 yards up the slope. Then it was answered by another scream from across the river, on the opposite canyon wall. I made a decision to move everyone closer to the rafts and away from the forest edge. I told the clients we had a predator situation and needed to stay near the beach for safety. We moved our sleeping bags down to the sand near the rafts, built up the fire, and I stayed awake with my bear spray and flare gun ready. The screaming continued throughout the night, always from multiple locations, always seeming to get closer. Around 2 a.m., I heard something large moving through the brush on the slope above camp, breaking branches, creating noise that suggested something much bigger than a deer or elk. The sounds moved laterally across the slope, paralleling our camp, staying just out of sight in the darkness. Around 4 a.m., as dawn was approaching, I saw something that made me question my 19 years of experience on this river. A figure, standing upright on the slope, maybe 150 yards above camp, silhouetted against the lightening sky. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, broad shoulders, standing completely still watching our camp. I watched it for maybe 2 minutes, then it turned and walked away, moving with a smooth bipedal gait that was clearly natural, disappearing into the forest. I didn't wake the clients. When they got up around 6 a.m., I told them we were breaking camp early and getting on the river immediately, cutting short our usual leisurely breakfast routine. They sensed my urgency and cooperated. We were on the water by 7 a.m., 2 days ahead of our planned departure from that camp. As we floated away from Lance Bar, I looked back at the slope where I'd seen the figure. In the morning light, I could see a trail of broken branches and disturbed vegetation leading down from higher on the slope toward where we'd been camped, suggesting something large had been moving toward us during the night. We completed the trip without further incident, reaching the takeout at Vinegar Creek 2 days later. I didn't tell the clients what I'd seen, not wanting to frighten them, or create a situation where they'd leave negative reviews that could hurt my business. But I filed a report with the Forest Service describing the screams and what I'd observed. The official response was that I'd probably heard and seen a black bear, even though bears don't scream like that and don't stand 8 feet tall. My report was noted, but no investigation was conducted. But I talked to other river guides who run the main salmon, people I've known for years in this tight-knit community. Several admitted they'd had experiences they couldn't explain at remote camps along the river. Screams that don't match any known wildlife, rocks being thrown into camps from the darkness, the sense of being watched from the slopes above camps, figures seen briefly in early morning or late evening light. Owen Guide, with over 25 years' experience, told me about a trip in 2008 where his entire group heard screaming for 3 consecutive nights from the canyon walls, so loud and close that nobody slept. On the 3rd night, something threw rocks down onto their beach camp from above. Not random rockfall, but deliberately thrown, landing in a pattern around their tents. He moved the group downriver early the next morning. The Nez Perce people, whose ancestral territory includes the Salmon River corridor, and who traveled this river for thousands of years before white settlement, have traditional knowledge about canyon dwellers they call by names in their language that translate to stone throwers, or canyon guardians. According to their teachings, these beings live on the steep canyon slopes, emerge at night especially during early summer, and they don't want human camps in certain locations they consider sacred or territorial. I continue guiding on the Salmon River because it is my passion and my livelihood, but I no longer use Lance Bar as a camp location, even though it is one of the best beaches on the river. and I am much more selective about which camps I use during early summer. When I am scouting a potential camp and I feel that sense of being watched from above, when the forest goes silent in ways that feel unnatural, I float past that location and find another camp. The main salmon flows for 79 miles through roadless wilderness, with canyon walls rising thousands of feet, much of it so steep and rugged that it has never been explored on foot. Perfect habitat for something that wants to remain hidden, but monitors human activity along the river corridor. And based on what I heard and saw that night and conversations with other longtime guides, something does live on those canyon slopes. Something that screams in coordinated patterns from multiple locations. Something that stands 8 feet tall and watches camps. And something that makes it clear through intimidation which locations along the river are acceptable for human camps, and which belong to the canyon's permanent residents. My name is Silas Yoder. I am 67 years old, and I've worked as a backcountry horsepacker and outfitter in Idaho's Sawtooth National Forest for 44 years, running pack trips, supply missions for remote cabins, and wilderness expeditions using strings of mules and horses. This happened last September during a supply run I was making to a remote hunting camp in the White Cloud Mountains, a spectacular range within the Sawtooth National Forest, known for jagged granite peaks and pristine alpine lakes. I was traveling alone with a string of 6 mules carrying supplies, following trails I'd used for over 4 decades. I'd left the trailhead at Chamberlain Basin around 8 a.m., planning a 12-mile trip to the hunting camp, located at around 8,500 feet elevation. The trail climbed steadily through lodgepole pine forest, crossing several creeks, eventually reaching alpine meadows with spectacular views of the White Cloud peaks. Around 2 p.m., I was at about 8,000 feet elevation, moving through a section of trail that crossed a large alpine meadow, maybe half a mile across. The mules were behaving normally, moving steadily, no signs of concern. I was about halfway across the meadow when all 6 mules stopped simultaneously. In 44 years of packing, I'd never seen all the animals stop together like that without clear cause like a predator or obstacle. They stood completely still, ears forward, all looking in the same direction toward a patch of Krumhold's timber at the upper edge of the meadow. I looked where they were staring but saw nothing unusual. I urged them forward. They wouldn't move. I got off my horse and tried leading them. The lead mule, an animal I'd owned for 15 years and trusted completely, refused to budge. All 6 animals were locked in place, staring at that timber, showing every sign of fear despite no visible threat. Then I smelled it, an odor that I'd never encountered in 44 years in Idaho wilderness. Musky, pungent, strong enough to reach me from 50 yards downwind. Not bear, not elk, not any animal I knew from 4 decades in these mountains. The smell was so distinctive and powerful that it made me wrinkle my nose and step back. I decided to honor the mule's instinct. In 44 years, I'd learned that mules sense danger before humans do, and when they refuse to move, there is usually a good reason. I tried to lead the string on a different route, skirting around the edge of the meadow away from the timber where the animals were focused. As I was repositioning the string, I saw something that made me glad I'd listened to the mules. Movement in the Krumholds. Something large, dark, moving through the stunted trees at the meadow's edge. From the movement pattern and size, it was clear this wasn't elk or moose. It was walking upright on 2 legs, pushing through vegetation that was 6 to 7 feet tall, meaning whatever it was stood significantly taller than the brush. E watched for maybe 30 seconds as it moved parallel to the meadow edge, apparently following a course that would have intersected my original trail if I'd continued forward. Then it disappeared into denser timber. The mules remained frozen, refusing to move even after the figure was gone. I made a decision based on the mule's fear and what I'd observed. I was turning around and heading back to the trailhead, abandoning the supply run. In 44 years of packing, I'd never turned back from a job because of fear. But something about this situation felt dangerous, in a way I couldn't fully articulate. I got the mules turned around, which they did willingly, eager to move away from that area. We headed back down the trail at a faster pace than normal. About a mile down from the meadow, I stopped to let the animals rest. That is when I heard it. Rock-clacking, two sharp sounds, like rocks being struck together coming from the timber above the trail. Then two more clacks from below the trail. Then two more from behind us. I'd heard about rock-clacking from other packers, always dismissed it as campfire stories. But here I was, experiencing it firsthand. The sounds continued as we moved down the trail, always from multiple directions, always in that same pattern of two clacks. It felt like we were being followed and monitored by multiple individuals, coordinating their positions. We reached the trailhead around 6 p.m. The mules were sweating and stressed, despite the cool temperature, showing they'd been as frightened as I was. I called the outfitter who'd hired me for the supply run and explained I hadn't completed the delivery, citing dangerous trail conditions without giving the real reason. But I talked to other packers who work Idaho backcountry, men I've known for decades in this profession. Several admitted they'd had experiences they couldn't explain. Animals refusing to move for no visible reason, that distinctive musky smell appearing in remote areas, rock-clacking patterns that suggest communication, seeing figures in the distance that move upright through terrain where humans shouldn't be. One packer told me about an experience in the Pioneer Mountains in the 1990s. His entire mule string stampeded, breaking their pack saddles and scattering supplies across a meadow. It took him 2 days to recover all the animals. He found tracks near where the stampede started, barefoot prints larger than any human, multiple sets suggesting a group had approached his string from upwind, where the mules would scent them first. The Shoshone, Bannock people, whose ancestral territory includes the Sawtooth Mountains and who've traveled these ranges for thousands of years, have traditional knowledge about mountain beings they describe as stone giants or high country people. According to their teachings, these beings live above timberline in summer, descending to lower elevations in fall and winter, and they're territorial about areas they consider their domain, particularly during autumn when they're preparing for winter. I continue packing in Idaho because it is what I've done for 44 years, and it is all I know. But I no longer take trips into the White Cloud Mountains during September, even though it is prime hunting season and economically important for my business. And I trust my mules completely. When they refuse to move and show fear, I don't question their judgment anymore. I turn around, regardless of the financial cost or damage to my reputation. The Sawtooth National Forest and White Cloud Mountains contain hundreds of thousands of acres of roadless wilderness, much of it above 8,000 feet elevation, with terrain so rugged that many areas have never been fully explored. Perfect habitat for something that wants to avoid human contact. And based on what I witnessed in the mules' behavior and conversations with other longtime packers, something does live in those high alpine areas. Something large enough to move through 7-foot brush while remaining upright. Something that creates a musky odor unlike any known wildlife. And something that uses rock-clacking in coordinated patterns, suggesting communication between multiple individuals monitoring human movement through their territory.